November rain had a way of swallowing sound in Ashford. That night the wind pressed against the rusted walls of the old paper mill, rattling loose sheets of tin like a slow, uneven drumbeat. Inside, the hum of the conveyor belts and the hiss of steam pipes wrapped the factory in a kind of mechanical heartbeat, steady and familiar. It was nearly closing time for the night shift, though no one kept track by the clock anymore, only by the rhythm of the machines. Thomas Whitaker, a man who had worked these floors for more than 2 decades, moved with quiet certainty among the stacks of rolled paper. He knew every shadow here, every creak in the boards, every pocket of warmth where the boiler's breath reached. His jacket was damp from the walk-in, shoulders dusted with flecks of pulp. Outside, the rain had been falling since noon, soaking the town's brick streets and painting the mill's windows with trembling silver. No one saw him leave that night, no one saw him cross the parking lot or step into the streetlights beyond. When his station fell silent, the other workers assumed he'd taken a quick walk to the storage bays, maybe to check on one of the crates scheduled for shipping. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the silence that followed. 10 minutes passed, then 20. By the time the foreman went looking, the basement corridor stood empty, the air damp and heavy as though it had been holding its breath. The rain kept falling long after midnight. It would be 3 days before anyone outside the mill heard the news, and by then, Thomas Whitaker was gone. Not just missing, gone, in a way that felt as if the walls themselves had swallowed him whole. Before that night, Thomas Whitaker was the kind of man people in Ashford barely noticed, and yet everyone trusted. He lived in a modest clapboard house on Elm Street with his teenage daughter, Emily, a girl with the same quiet eyes as her father. His wife had passed 5 years earlier, and since then, Thomas had balanced his life between long shifts at the mill and evenings spent cooking simple dinners, listening to the radio, and helping Emily with her homework at the kitchen table. He wasn't a man of big words or bold gestures. His affection showed in the small things: polishing Emily's shoes before school, making sure the porch light was on when she walked home from a friend, keeping a slice of pie wrapped for her in the fridge. At the mill, he was steady and dependable, the kind of worker who could fix a jammed press with nothing more than a wrench and a roll of duct tape. He'd been there since his 20s, starting on the loading docks and working his way up to machine operator. Coworkers said he never raised his voice, never rushed his tasks, and never complained when extra hours were tacked onto his shift. They also remembered how, in the weeks before he vanished, he had begun taking his breaks alone in the farthest corner of the lower storage wing, a spa most avoided because of its damp smell and poor lighting. When asked about it, he'd smile in that soft, almost apologetic way of his and say he liked the quiet. Outside of work, his world was small but solid. Saturday mornings were for grocery shopping, Sunday afternoons for repairing whatever was broken around the house. He enjoyed old Western films, strong coffee, and fishing at the narrow bend of the Ashford River when the weather allowed. To neighbors, Thomas was a fixture of the town's slow rhythm, as much a part of Ashford as the church steeple or the clang of the mill's shift bell. Which is why when he disappeared, the absence felt less like a missing person and more like someone had pulled a thread from the town itself, one that no one realized was holding so much together until it was gone. It was subtle at first, the kind of change you only notice when you've known a person for years. A month before Thomas vanished, Emily recalled how he began locking the basement door at home, something he had never done before. When she asked why, he brushed it off with a half-smile and said he was just keeping tools safe. But there was a flicker in his eyes she didn't recognize, like he was thinking of something he couldn't quite bring himself to say. At the mill, a few coworkers noticed him arriving earlier than usual, well before his shift started, and heading straight toward the older storage bay. These were rarely used anymore, left over from the mill's busier decades, their floors warped from dampness, their walls smelling faintly of mildew. One night, Jacob Miles, who worked the late shift with Thomas, caught a glimpse of him down there, kneeling beside a stack of crates. Jacob swore Thomas was holding a small flashlight and reading something on a sheet of yellowed paper. But when Jacob called out, Thomas quickly folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket pocket. There were other odd moments. Twice, Thomas was seen speaking quietly with a man no one recognized, a stranger in a heavy coat who waited for him in the alley behind the mill. The meetings were brief, no more than a minute or two, and when asked about it later, Thomas claimed it was just an old friend passing through town. But the explanation didn't sit right with anyone who knew him. Thomas didn't have old friends from out of town. His life was here, every piece of it. Emily, too, began to sense a weight in him during those last weeks. He would stare at the radio some evenings, the music playing low, his food growing cold on the plate. Once when she asked if something was wrong at work, he shook his head but said, almost under his breath, "Some things are better left where they are." She didn't understand it then. Later, she would replay that moment in her mind again and again, wondering what it was he'd been trying to keep buried, and whether it had followed him. Into that rain-soaked night, the night Thomas disappeared began like any other late shift. A steady drizzle had turned into a cold, driving rain by the time he walked through the mill's side entrance at 9 o'clock. The air inside was thick with the smell of wet pulp and hot oil, the machines thundering in their usual rhythm. Workers moved in practiced patterns, voices raised over the roar, boots clanging against the grated floors, at 10:14 p.m. According to the punch clock and the foreman's later account, Thomas left his station on the Maine conveyor line. He told a coworker he was going to check on the storage bays in the basement, something he'd done many times before. No one followed. The basement corridors were dimly lit, the single overhead bulbs spaced far apart so that pockets of shadow seemed to hover in the air. Rain hammered the tin roof above, and somewhere in the depths of the building, a pipe hissed steadily, releasing a fine mist into the cold air. The last confirmed sighting came from Jacob Miles, who was on his way to the break room. He saw Thomas descending the narrow metal staircase toward the lower level, his hand grazing the rail, his shoulders hunched slightly as if against a wind that wasn't there. Jacob remembered calling out a quick remark about the weather. Thomas glanced back briefly, gave a small nod, then disappeared from view. Minutes passed. The sound of the conveyor belts filled the silence where his footsteps should have been. By 10:30, the foreman noticed his station was unattended. A call over the loudspeaker went unanswered. When two workers went to check the basement, they found nothing, no sign of Thomas, no sound beyond the echo of their own boots on the concrete. The crates in the far corner stood as they always had, dust settling thick on their lids, the air heavy and still. Outside, the rain kept falling, pooling in the yard, streaming down the brick walls. Inside, the mill carried on, machines working as if nothing had changed, as if one man could simply vanish into the spaces between the sound and the S. Haddo's, the search for Thomas began before sunrise the next morning. Word had spread quickly through Ashford, and by dawn the mill's yard was crowded with workers still in their uniforms, neighbors in raincoats, and the low murmur of police radios. The foreman, Harold Kemp, led officers down the same basement stairwell Thomas had taken, pointing out the narrow aisles between the old storage crate. Nothing looked disturbed, no footprints in the dust, no misplaced tools. The air was cool and stale, smelling faintly of damp paper and rust. By mid-morning, search teams had fanned out into the surrounding streets, the riverbank, and the stretch of woods that bordered the mill's eastern wall. Officers with flashlights combed through drainage tunnels. Divers were sent into the murky bend of the Ashford River despite the strong currents stirred up by the rain. They surfaced with nothing but silt and tangled weeds. Helicopters from the county sheriff's department circled overhead, their rotors sending ripples through the puddles below. Emily stood at the edge of the mill's loading dock, clutching a damp photograph of her father. She handed it to every officer who passed, her voice quiet but firm, repeating the same words, "Please find him, he wouldn't just leave." Friends from the neighborhood brought thermoses of coffee, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, anything to keep the searchers going. The town's volunteer fire brigade joined in, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen Thomas walking in the storm. By the end of the second day, the optimism had begun to fade. The police chief announced that no signs of foul play had been found, though he admitted they couldn't rule it out. Rumors began to circulate, some whispered he'd run off, others that he'd met with an accident somewhere deep in the machinery. But for those who knew Thomas, those explanations felt thin, almost insulting. He had roots here, a life here, a daughter who was his entire world. The thought that he could vanish without leaving a trace pressed down on everyone like the rain-soaked clouds that refused to lift. And still, each night the searchlights swept the river and the mill's broken windows, hoping for the smallest glint of something left behind. Weeks passed, and the search for Thomas turned into something quieter, heavier. The initial rush of urgency gave way to long days where nothing new emerged, only the slow grind of unanswered questions. The police continued to check tips, but each one ended the same way: an empty lot, a wrong face, a story that crumbled under the smallest scrutiny. One lead had the entire search team combing an abandoned rail yard 3 miles out of town. A man claimed he'd seen someone matching Thomas's description there on the night of the storm, carrying what looked like a small metal case. Officers spent hours climbing over rusted cars and peeling through stacks of scrap, the wind whistling through broken windows. They found nothing. Another tip sent divers back into the Ashford River when a fisherman thought he'd snagged a piece of clothing on his hook. It turned out to be an old tarp tangled in roots. For Emily, the hardest part was the waiting. Each ring of the phone made her heart lurch, each knock at the door filled her with a hope that dissolved as soon as she saw the look on the visitor's face. She tried to keep her father's routines alive, making coffee in the old percolator, leaving the porch light on at night, but the house began to feel different, like it was holding its breath along with her. The mill's workers returned to their shifts, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations were shorter, glances sharper. The basement storage bays, once just another part of the building, now carried a weight of unease. Some refused to go down there alone. Others claimed they heard footsteps where no one was walking, or the sound of something scraping against the floor in the far corner. Most chalked it up to nerves. Still, the whispers spread, and the image of Thomas's last walk down those stairs lodged itself in everyone's mind. By the end of the 3rd month, the police scaled back their presence. Officially, the case remained open, but the searchlights were gone, the helicopters silent. In their place was a kind of void, a gap where answers should have been and where only the sound of the river and the mill's endless hum remained. It was more than 3 decades later when the mill, long abandoned and sagging under its own weight, was sold to a developer who planned to tear it down. By then, Thomas Whitaker's disappearance had become a quiet legend in Ashford, something mentioned in passing to newcomers, usually with a shake of the head and a half-smile that said, "You'll never get the full story." The demolition crew arrived in early spring, their boots crunching over shattered glass, their voices echoing in the hollow spaces where machines had once thundered. On the 3rd day, a worker named Mike Hollies was assigned to clear out the lower basement bays. Most of the crates there had rotted from years of damp, their corners softened, their labels faded into illegible stains. But in the farthest corner, beyond a stack of rusted shelving, Mike found a row of 6 wooden crates stacked neatly against the wall. Unlike the others, these were sealed tight, the metal bands around them unbroken, their wood darkened but intact. The dust on top was thick enough to leave deep finger trails. Mike called over his foreman, who frowned at the sight. The demolition record said nothing about these crates, and the dates stenciled faintly along their sides, November 1987, made the hair on the back of his neck rise. That was the month Thomas had vanished. The crew debated leaving them for the salvage team, but curiosity got the better of them. The first band snapped with a sharp metallic crack, the sound carrying through the empty room. Inside was nothing like they expected. Not new paper rolls ready for shipment, not the kind of scrap the mill had been known to hide away in its lean years, but something older, stranger. Bundles of water-stained sheets wrapped in oilcloth, a stack of cardboard boxes sealed with yellowing tape, and tucked in the corner of one crate, a Small metal lunchbox, its latch rusted shut. Mike picked it up, feeling its surprising weight, and for the first time in years, the air in that basement seemed to hold a breath, waiting for what came next. The lunchbox gave way with a reluctant squeal as Mike pried the latch open with the edge of a crowbar. The smell that escaped was faint but distinct, a mix of old paper, dust, and something metallic like the inside of an abandoned safe. Inside, beneath a folded handkerchief so brittle it crumbled at his touch, was a stack of photographs tied together with fraying twine. The top image was of the mill floor, crowded with workers, all smiling for the camera. Mike didn't recognize any of the faces, but one man standing slightly apart from the others drew his eye. He was tall with a narrow face and sharp, watchful eyes. Under the photos were loose pages torn from what seemed to be a journal. The handwriting was small and deliberate, each line pressed into the paper as if the writer had been afraid the words might fade. Most of it was mundane, production notes, whether names of shipments, but here and there were fragments that made no sense. Phrases like "he comes down at night" and "the south wall is hollow" stood out against the otherwise orderly script. Mike flipped through them quickly, but the last item stopped him cold. Wrapped in a scrap of brown paper was a tarnished brass key, heavy in the palm, its teeth long and oddly cut. Stamped along its bow were the letters TWHE. Didn't know why, but the initials gave him a chill. When he told the foreman what he'd found, the man only frowned deeper and told him to lock everything back up until the developer decided what to do. But later that night, lying in bed, Mike couldn't stop thinking about the phrase "south wall is hollow." He'd been in that basement for days and had never noticed anything unusual there. By morning, he'd made up his mind. Before the wrecking ball touched the building, he was going back. Rain slicked the cracked pavement as Mike made his way back to the old mill before dawn. The town was still asleep, the only sound the hiss of water running along the gutters. He slipped through the side entrance he'd used before, the hinges whining in protest, and stepped into the dark belly of the building. The air was damp, colder than it should have been, carrying a faint echo that seemed to follow his every move. He worked his way toward the south wall, counting the steps just as he had in his head the night before. The beam of his flashlight swept across flaking paint and rusted pipes until it landed on a section where the bricks looked newer, cleaner somehow. He ran his hand over the surface. It gave off a hollow thud. Setting down the light, he pried at the mortar with the crowbar. The first brick came loose with surprising ease, then another. A gap began to form, revealing darkness beyond. He reached in, fingers brushing something smooth and cold. Pulling it out, he found a small wooden box, the varnish dulled by years of neglect. Inside was a single object, a pocket watch, silver, engraved with the same initials as the key. TWIT was stopped at exactly 2:17. Mike's breath caught. He had no reason to understand why that mattered, but the weight in his chest told him it did. Somewhere in the distance, a floorboard creaked. He froze, every muscle locked, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. He wasn't alone. Mike's grip tightened around the pocket watch, the cool metal biting into his palm. His flashlight beam wavered as he turned toward the sound, his breath shallow and quick. In the shadows beyond the broken wall, a figure emerged, tall, hunched slightly, a hood pulled low over their face. "Who's there?" Mike's voice cracked, louder than he intended. The figure didn't answer, only took another slow step forward, the sound of their boots against the warped floorboards echoing in the hollow space. The box slipped from Mike's other hand, landing with a soft thud at his feet. He took a step back, his shoulders brushing the cold brick behind him. The stranger stopped just at the edge of the flashlight's reach, their face still hidden. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried across the room like a warning. Mike swallowed hard. "Neither should you." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Then, in a sudden motion, the figure reached into their coat and pulled something out, a folded photograph, worn and creased. They held it up just enough for the light to catch it. Mike's eyes locked on the image. It was him. Standing in front of the very same wall he had just torn open, but the date scrawled on the back, April 14, 1973, made his stomach twist. That was nearly 50 years ago. Mike stumbled out into the cold night air, the photograph still burning in his mind. The abandoned paper mill loomed behind him, its dark windows watching like 100 unblinking eyes. Somewhere inside those crates remained untouched, their contents still a mystery. Maybe it was better that way, or maybe walking away was the biggest mistake he could ever make. As he reached his truck, he glanced once more at the pocket watch, its ticking steady and deliberate, as if marking time for something yet to come. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. If you think you figured out what was inside those crates, or why someone waited decades to leave that photograph behind, share your theory in the comments. And if you want to see what else we uncover in places the world has forgotten, make sure you subscribe, turn on the bell, and join me in the next chapter of this mystery. The truth is out there, you just have to dare to look for it.